Welcome back. Let us start Session 3. First, Mr. Emmanuel Faber, Chair ISSB, will give a keynote speech.
Hello, distinguished guests. Thank you all for your participation in the GGX TCFD Summit. And to our gracious hosts at METI, thank you for once again creating such a valuable forum and inviting me to address this impressive gathering. At last year's TCFD Summit, my friend Hiro Mizuno and I discussed the international disclosure landscape at a time when the ISSB was less than 1 year old. Now, I am delighted to share with you the progress that has been made since that discussion. First, in June of this year, the ISSB launched its inaugural standards IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. IFRS S1 provides a set of overarching disclosure requirements designed to enable companies to communicate to investors about sustainability-related risks and opportunities they face over the short, the mid, and the long term. IFRS S2, which sets out specific climate-related disclosures and is designed to be used with IFRS S1, also incorporates the recommendations of the TCFD. The ISSB standards were developed in response to strong market demand among investors, companies, and international policymakers for decision-useful, comparable information and for a simplified and more efficient reporting landscape. Second, soon after achieving this major milestone, IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 received the public endorsement of IOSCO, whose members include 130 international securities regulators worldwide. And third, also in July, the Financial Stability Board of G20 announced that the work of the TCFD had reached its culmination in IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. And we made TCFD part of both of our standards. I personally have been a fan of the TCFD since the beginning and always admired its leadership on raising the bar for climate-related disclosures, so I found this outcome tremendously encouraging. As chair of the ISSB, I see it as strong evidence that we're moving in the right direction in fulfillment of our mission to provide a global baseline of sustainability-related financial disclosures with the necessary detail and specificity. In addition, the Financial Stability Board also announced that TCFD is handing the baton to the ISSB, and as of 2024, the ISSB will assume responsibility for regularly monitoring progress on climate-related disclosures for the FSB. So while the work of TCFD has concluded, the legacy of their groundbreaking work continues to live on. We are finally grateful that our work is backed by the G7 and that the Sustainability Standards Board of Japan is committing to advancing a global baseline of sustainability-related financial disclosures. With that, I'd like to finish by commending your community at the TCFD Summit in Japan for your groundbreaking work and say that you're probably well equipped now to prepare under the ISSB standards coming. So thank you very much.
Next, we would like to invite to the podium Mr. Miyazono Masataka, President, Government Pension Investment Fund, to give a keynote speech.
GPIF 理事長の宮園正隆です。本日は GGX TCFD サミット2023でお話をする機会をいただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。GPIF が運用する約220兆円の年金積立金は、これから50年以上先の少子高齢化が進んだ2070年代以降に、年金給付の財源として本格的に使われるものです。それまで長期にわたって世界中の株式、債券等に幅広く分散投資し、世界の資本市場の成長の果実をリターンとして享受し、積立金を将来世代のために増やしていくこと、これが GPIF に与えられたミッションです。一方で、 ESG に関するさまざまな問題は、市場に負の影響を及ぼします。これを小さくすることによって、資本市場が持続的に成長することが、GPIF の運用資産の長期的な投資収益を確保する上で、すなわちミッションを果たしていく上で不可欠となります。こうしたことから GPIF は ESG を考慮した投資を推進する、このことを投資原則に掲げて取り組んでいます。さて、ESG の負の影響の中でも、とりわけ気候変動がもたらすリスクは、すべての種類の資産や銘柄に対して同時に生じるため、いかに分散投資を行っても完全に消すことはできません。また、長期的なスパンでは顕在化する可能性が極めて高いリスクであると考えられています。従いまして、GPIF は気候変動を ESG 活動の最重要テーマの一つと位置づけまして、2018年12月には TCFD への賛同を表明いたしますとともに、2019年からは TCFD の提言に沿った気候関連財務情報の開示を続けております。GPIF は自らの ESG 活動の効果検証や TCFD の提言を踏まえた気候変動リスク機会に関する分析など、これらを毎年 ESG 活動報告として取りまとめて公表しています。最新の2022年度版の活動報告では、気候変動リスク機会の評価と分析の一環として、温室効果ガス GHG の削減貢献量に関する分析を行いました。本サミットにおいても削減貢献量をテーマにしたセッションが組まれておりますが、グリーントランスフォーメーションにおいて脱炭素技術を適正に評価することは、私ども投資家にとっても、また社会全体にとっても大変重要なことだと考えております。すなわち、投資家にとって企業の競争力や企業価値を評価する上で、削減貢献量を反映することは、今後必要不可欠なものになると、このように考えられます。また、社会全体から見れば、GHG の排出削減に大きく貢献する技術や企業が正しく評価され、技術開発や生産拡大に必要な資金が潤沢に供給されることがカーボンニュートラルを実現する上での大前提となります。私どもの2022年度版 ESG 活動報告では、またグリーンボンドなどの ESG 債のインパクトに関する情報開示についても分析を行いました。国際資本市場協会 ICMA が公表しているグリーンボンド原則では、債券発行後に資金が充当されたプロジェクトで環境や社会にどのようなインパクトが生じたのか、これを開示するように求められています。ところが私どもが保有する ESG 債について調べてみますと、ICMAに準拠していることなどを謳ったグリーンボンドであっても、インパクトの実績が開示されていない債券が一定数存在することが分かりました。やはり ESG 債のインパクトが適切に評価されて、ESG の市場価格形成にも影響を及ぼすようになることが、削減貢献量と同様に資本市場を通じた適切な資本配分という観点で非常に重要なことだと私どもは考えています。GPIF は自らが気候変動財務関連情報をはじめとする ESG 情報の開示拡充に取り組むことで、市場全体の持続可能性向上に貢献してまいる所存であります。この度の GGX TCFD サミットがインベストメントチェーンを構成するさまざまな参加者による活動のさらなる活性化につながることを期待申し上げます。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Mr. Miyazono. Next, we'd like to invite to the podium Mr. Mizuno Hiromichi, founder and CEO, Good Steward Partners LLC, to give a keynote speech.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. It's been my honor to come back to GGX and TCFD Summit. I have been involved in this summit from the beginning when I was the special advisor to Mehdi on the TCFD and the green transition. I remember the first meeting which took place in Tokyo. There's the big the excitement among the sustainable disclosure community or sustainable finance community about the Japan is stepping up to lead this work on the sustainable disclosure. I just came back from New York to attend the UN Climate Summit, where I bumped into Mark Carney. And almost each time I bumped into him, he talked about his memory of the first TCFD Summit meeting in Tokyo. So this is the kind of like a legacy of how the TCFD became the global movement, and then like how the Japanese government and the Japanese corporation and all the other members of the TCFD consortium has contributed to the global agenda on the sustainability disclosure. And it has been proved by the quality of the guests attending this the TCFD Summit. So I'm so grateful to see all of you coming to this conference in Tokyo. I think the initial role or genesis of the TCFD has been kind of like changing, as now the ISSV is already on their track to introduce the first disclosure framework on the climate. And then there's a lot of the take up by the financial community and the private sectors. Japan again are showing their full-hearted support to make the ISSV disclosure as a standard among Japanese corporations. And I really appreciate like a Japanese, the financial regulator has been very proactive about the promoting this new global disclosure standard on sustainability. I think the time to argue that how we can get the data will be ending. Because disclosure is one thing, basically give the access to the investor, give investors access to the data. But from now on, we just need to figure out how to model those informations and use it for our financial analysis and decision making. I recently working with the MSCI is one of the other provider of the climate data, and they are working on the modeling those data to be investment useful. I think there will be a lot of efforts made by the service providers to how to interpret the data being disclosed. So the time to cry for the more data should be ending, and the time to cry for how we can use it is going to be our main theme. I just want to touch upon the recent anti-ESG or anti-sustainable investment political movement in the US. Because I regard that the Japan has been historically following what's happening in the US and in Europe. And in the situation like this, that the US and Europe seems to be going in a totally different direction, it's hard for the Japanese, the investor community and also the corporate business community to find the direction. I think this is a time for you to really ask yourself that whether you genuinely believe climate risk is a systemic risk to affect your portfolio, your business portfolio, investment portfolio, what kind of portfolio you are working on. I have been asking the financial community that you believe, if the climate risk will affect your performance. And the answer has been universally yes. And I think it's a fiduciary duty of the financial professional. If you believe that's the fundamental risk for your portfolio management, you need to manage it. So what's happening in the US is more like the political attack on the ESG, saying it's not the financially material information. And given the US is entering into the presidential campaign, I think we're going to hear a lot of noises around the ESG. And some of the institutions are trying to dodge the political attack by changing the vocabulary, stop using ESG, and are using the sustainability instead. But that kind of thing is okay, because if you are the business and trying not get involved in a political, dispute, You may want to change the vocabulary, but you just cannot hide that what you believe will be the critical risk for your businesses. So the TCFD has provided the very, very high-level framework for the climate risk and opportunity disclosure. And then when I was the guest speaker to the TCFD task force organized by METI, and where the chairman was Kunio Ito sensei, I just felt like the TCFD will not be the final framework, but I thought the TCFD will provide the overarching framework for the final disclosure policies. And I think my expectations proving is right. So I think the Japanese corporations and Japan is actually, I'm very proud to see Japan is being the biggest contributor to the TCFD movement by having the largest number of signatories, and also the TCFD consortium that played a lot of role in mutually improving understanding of how to use the TCFD framework for their business disclosure. And as my friend Emmanuel mentioned in his remarks, I think those works on the TCFD has prepared the Japanese corporations much better than the others to be able to adjust their disclosures system to ISSB standard, which has not been proven is going to be the final framework, but it has the best chance to be a mainstream financial disclosure framework on sustainability. I also want to touch upon the President Miyazono's speech about the GPIF ESG report. I strongly recommend you guys, you also take a look at the ESG reporting made by the GPIF. There's a lot of very interesting information in that. And then their effort to disclose the contribution to decarbonization will be more standard or more universal. Because without measuring the positive impact on the decarbonization by the businesses, it's hard to fairly price the climate risk and opportunity into the financial market. And then I was a bit surprised and a bit disappointed to see the even compliant ESG bond or green bond seems to be failing the full disclosure of their impact. And if you have any holding of the ESG bond or green bond, please take a look at, because those impacts should be measured and should be held accountable. Having all said that, I really believe that all these efforts made by the METI and then all the people and the members of the TCFD consortium and all the distinguished guests attending here, we are pushing the world in the right direction. And whatever happens in the US in the political agenda, I think the reality of the nature and the reality of their impact on the business and our investment portfolio will remain our concern. And if we don't have a proper disclosure, we're not going to be able to manage it. But now we're probably getting closer to having the fair disclosure of data. We should commit all our effort to build the model on those data and how to find out how to integrate it into our investment decision and also your business decisions. Thank you again for giving me an opportunity. I think this may be the last TCFD Summit, because the next year should kind of expand into more the sustainable, the sustainable investment disclosure or maybe GGX. But I really appreciate all the effort and progress made by the people participating in this movement in Japan. And I really want to see even further progress and Japan leading this movement in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mizuno. Now, we will move on to panel discussion 3. Panel discussion 3 is entitled Future of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The facilitator of this session is Mr. Nagamura Masaaki, Fellow, International Initiatives, Tokyo Marine Holdings, Inc. Mr. Nagamura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion 3. This panel focuses on the future of climate-related financial disclosures. My name is Masaki Nagamura, Fellow for International Initiatives at Tokyo Marine Holdings. I have also had the privilege of serving the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures as a member. It is a great honor to facilitate this panel. We have 4 experts lined up to form the panel. So let me start by introducing the panelists. Sitting immediately next to me, Mr. Alex Mickey. He's the head of GFAN's Secretariat. Then we have Mr. Satoshi Ikeda, Chief Sustainable Finance Officer at Japan's Financial Services Agency. Participating online, we have Mr. Tomohiro Ishikawa, Chief Regulatory Engagement Officer at Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group. Then last but not least, we have Ms. Keiko Kitagawa, General Manager, Sustainability Promotion Unit, Global Investor Relations Group at JERA. Thank you all for making yourselves available for this session. Before I ask each panelist to speak, let me take a moment to highlight some of the notable developments that we have seen in the realm of climate-related financial disclosures. I recall from the panel discussion at last year's TCFD Summit, where I touched upon the rapid changes that had taken place in this field. The pace of evolution continues. And as expected, the release of the IFRS S1 and S2 standards developed by the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, in late June turned out as groundbreaking. Now that we have the first set of international standards on sustainability disclosures, companies are expected to exert further efforts to enhance their disclosure to align with the requirements, including Scope 3 emissions and those applied specific to each sector, among others. One particular element that is attracting increasing level of attention, though, is the disclosure of transition plans. It was included in the TCFD's guidance on metrics and targets, which was released 2 years ago, and was also incorporated in the IFRS S2. The importance of transition plans was augmented by the public discussion on how to accelerate industrial transition towards net zero, particularly for those sectors considered as hard to abate, which is critical for decarbonizing the real economy. But this is not for free. Asia alone needs investments in the range of 26 to 37 trillion US dollars by 2050 to achieve decarbonization. Generating the flow of money in this magnitude calls for private sector investors and financial institutions to play a greater role. And in order for financiers to execute finance or investment to help the transition, climate-related corporate disclosures that incorporate transition plans become all the more important. Against this backdrop, I would like to solicit the views of the panelists on the current trend and what efforts are being made. Starting with the financial industry, let me ask Ishikawa-san, who I believe is participating from somewhere in Europe. Ishikawa-san, it is great to have your attendance from Europe. As you are deeply involved in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, could you share your first-hand view on the current discussions around transition finance and transition planning, along with your ongoing activities? Ishikawa-san, please.
Sure, thank you very much. And let me first say a huge thank you to METI for hosting this event and also inviting me to this panel discussion again. It's been 12 months, and I think we made a lot of progress, and I want to discuss briefly what's been the progress so far, but also what are the challenges we're facing. But Nagamura-san, you mentioned already, but I'm in Europe. I'm in Brussels today, and apologies not being there. And it's good to see you, Alex. You're being there, but I'm away. I'm in Brussels today, and I'll be in Europe throughout this week to meet with European policymakers to discuss our transition white paper, which we published 10 days ago or so. But of course, that tells not only MEFG story, but also Japan's story about transition plan and transition finance. And happy to come back to this point later in my intervention. But let me step back a little bit and discuss where we are and what are the challenges we're facing. I'm sure Alex will touch this on later, but more than 650 financial institutions committed to net zero, including 20 plus or so from Japan. And this itself is signaling an important message to the real economy, but without a appropriate appreciation that net zero journey is a multi-decade journey and truly complex undertaking, given the geopolitics, energy security, industrial competitive dynamics, and as we just heard, U.S. Presidential election, all those stuff will be part of this journey and the challenges. And we may end up creating a perverse outcome if we do not appreciate the complexity of this challenge. And we shouldn't just look at the one side of the equation, but I think we need to look at the whole picture. What's ahead of us? What do I mean by that? Let me unpack that. Committing net zero was an important first step, and many of us have announced interim target, 2030 interim target as a follow-up. And the question is, what are the levers we have to achieve these targets? The good news is that many of our clients in Japan, Asia, and other regions are increasingly moving to accelerate their journey to net zero. And as we proactively engage with our clients, we see many financing opportunities. We're optimistic that many of our clients, including JERA, by the way, on the stage, are allocating resources to new technology development and rollout to achieve net zero in the real economy. Given we, MEFG, has existing exposure to all sectors, including high-emitting sectors, we tell our clients, your decarbonization is my decarbonization. And we are willing to finance transition as long as meaningful emission reduction can be achieved, regardless of where the starting point is. Over time, as we finance transition, we will be able to reduce our finance emissions, but there's no guarantee that the pace of the reduction is in line with what we committed to, including the 2030 interim targets. The fact that our finance emission reduction depends on our client decarbonization trajectory indicates that if things go wrong, we may have to activate Plan B, which is to divest loans. But of course, which is not what we intend to do, and we want to do more straightforward engagement to reduce our finance emission, which is exactly what we said in our transition white paper. But that's the conundrum we're facing. How do we finance transition while reducing finance emission in the timeline we committed to our stakeholders? The problem with finance emission metrics is that this is point in time and backward looking. And this is a very issue many initiatives have been trying to address, including Japan's public-private working group that I've been part of, as well as GFANS, to which I'm also involved, as Alex is well aware. If we think about the real economy financing opportunities we provide new capital to, one of the questions as part of our due diligence process is the direct impact on our emission reduction from the transition finance. So in practice, we are going to require forward-looking reduction inputs from our clients when we assess new financing opportunities. And the question is, can we use this input to demonstrate the emission reduction impact? In fact, there are several ideas being proposed, such as avoided emission, as it was highlighted in the G7 communique, or the decarbonization contribution that GFANS recently proposed. The public-private working group led by METI, JFSA, and Ministry of Environment just published a stock-taking report which summarized potential approaches to address the challenge of finance emission. So you might want to have a look at it. I have it in front of me. This is already public. I believe it's in public so you might want to look at it. It's a helpful guide to understand the complex landscape, given many ideas have been proposed. What is consistent in these ideas is that metrics will not replace finance emission, rather they will complement and give a fuller picture to the stakeholders. In my view, the key factor to develop metrics are number one, practical, number two, standardized, number three, comparable, and four, transparent. We are still early stage in identifying the metrics that can address the shortcomings of finance emission, but we should remember that the purpose of the work undertaken is to encourage and develop the finance flow so that money will go to where the emissions are. The funding gap is huge, in order of trillions of dollars on an annual basis. And to mobilize such dollar amount, we need all hands on deck. While we made good progress in committing to net zero, given too much focus on finance emission reduction, we may end up creating unintended consequences. We need to learn the lessons and fix them before it's too late. Let me just flag that a working group under Net Zero Banking Alliance, which I chair, is also working on a metrics to demonstrate our progress on transition finance in a standardized manner. So hopefully we'll be able to publish in the next few weeks. We're very excited with the financing opportunity ahead of us, but let's make sure that we fix it before it's too late. Let me stop there and happy to come back to this point later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishikawa-san, for your comments and updates and introducing the paper released in Japan from Brussels. It was good to hear that the very latest from the very front line, as you're always in. I'll have another question for you later on, so please hold on for another 50 minutes or so. Now that we have heard about GFANZ, let me turn to Alex, who is normally in London but physically attending Tokyo and actually sitting next to me. Welcome to Tokyo, and thank you for being here. Since Ishikawa-san has shared his financial practitioner view on transition finance, could we also hear your views as head of GFANZ, as well as the ongoing efforts being made?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this wonderful conference. It's great to be among so many friends here in Tokyo. I think Tomo-san summarized some of the issues really well, actually, so I won't repeat too much of what he said. One thing I would flag is the importance of high-quality net zero transition plans to this entire discussion. So GFANZ delivered our transition plan framework to COP27 last year. That was produced by about 20 financial institutions. We're practitioner-led and secretariat supported. That was co-chaired by Noel Quinn, the CEO of HSBC, and Amanda Blanc, the CEO of Aviva. So it's pan-financial sector. It's meant to work not just for banks, but also asset owners, insurers, financial service providers, and investment consultants, and so on. What's been great this year is we've seen well over 50 financial institutions using that transition plan framework to publish and communicate their transition plan. So as you noted in your opening remarks, the TCFD actually recommends having a transition plan, but it doesn't say very much about what it should be in there. So GFANZ worked on it, both for the financial institutions and the real economy, their portfolio clients and customers. And we integrated it as well as we could with the TCFD. So for those of you who are familiar with the TCFD, which is probably all of you, the 5 components of the GFANZ transition plan framework will be very familiar. So it's quite easy to integrate into your TCFD reporting if that's how you want to communicate your transition plan. But I would emphasize that it's not just a disclosure framework. It's actually a strategic tool because the transition plan is a business-wide strategy that sets out, that helps you not just communicate, but helps you actually deliver the implementation and the achievement of your net zero goals and your interim 2030 science-based targets that Tomo-san was talking about. The other thing I would say that's related to what Tomo-san was saying is the issue of financed emissions. So our net zero transition plan framework, it identifies 4 types of financing strategies that are consistent with net zero. The first 2 might be quite obvious: climate solutions and financing for companies that are aligned with net zero or 1.5. that's traditionally covered by your green taxonomies. But what GFANS believes, both our members but also our leaders, Mark Carney often says, finance has to go to where the emissions are. We need a whole of economy transition. So there's not a single scientific scenario out there, whether it's IPCC or IEA or NGFS, that doesn't have huge increases in investment in hard to abate sectors to achieve net zero. So your investment in steel, in cement, in energy, in transport, aviation, and shipping, it needs to increase over the next 10 years. And because of the way financed emissions is measured, it's a backward-looking metric. So yes, maybe in 7 to 10 years, your financed emissions should be coming down quite sharply as those decarbonization contributions come through. But in the short term, you might have the odd incentives that Tomo-san was outlining. So that's why we've identified these 4 net zero aligned strategies. So the third one is aligning. So aligning, not aligned. So companies and corporates that have committed to net zero, that have a plan to get there, but are not yet on that 1.5 degree pathway. And then the fourth one is manage phase out of stranded assets, essentially. So how do you invest in, for example, an inefficient coal-fired power plant in a sensible, responsible way that's fair to the workers and communities to close it down earlier than its natural economic life? So they're the 4 strategies. Tomo-san mentioned a paper that we just released last week at New York Climate Week, or 2 weeks ago. That's how do we set the guardrails so that we can invest in these heavy emitting sectors in a way that is science-based, that is credible, that we can have confidence as net zero financial institutions that finance is being used for decarbonization in a way that's consistent with net zero. And then the second part of that is how do we come up with a measure of expected emissions reduction, a forward-looking metric. So the metrics around avoided emissions, which I think you were talking about this morning, are really relevant here. There are other ones as well. The consultation is open, so I'd encourage everyone to read the consultation. It's on our website, and please respond to it, because we need practitioners, we need experts like you to help us shape how should we measure the expected emissions reduction of net zero aligned finance. So I think one positive thing is financial institutions are using the net zero transition plans. They're talking to their portfolio companies about what's your net zero transition plan. And I think the other thing that's important is leading organizations, regulators, standard setters, supervisors are starting to think quite seriously, okay, well, this is what's happening voluntarily with best practice. How should we put in the frameworks in terms of regulation and standards and supervision to deliver that level playing field across the economy? And I think we'll come back to that later.
Great. Oh, thank you so much. I think we all have a clear understanding of what GFANS is up to. Apparently that sort of embraces not only the green finance part, but also apply to a broader aspect of whole economy transition. So that's pretty impressive. I'm so glad that the discussion has been going, following that direction. I bet the information was really valuable to non-financial industry players as well. So far we have learned how the international landscape of climate disclosures, with a particular focus on net zero transition. Many who are listening to this may wonder how it plays out in Japan. Let me turn to Ikeda-san and invite his view from a financial supervisor perspective. Ikeda-san, could you tell us how the developments around GFANS on transition finance and the publishing of the ISSB standards will possibly impact corporate disclosure practices in Japan, and how Japan is prepared or should start preparing for the anticipated changes?
Thank you for that question. Certainly, Ishikawa-san and Alex-san have laid out a very good background for my intervention. Well, if I may look back, well, I was involved with the establishing the certain transition finance framework in Japan together with METI and the Ministry of the Environment. And the motivation at the time was certainly the idea that we would need to establish a financial framework which really assess the impact of action by the corporates in terms of reducing emissions, so that the financial flows go into those companies who really tackle the challenges of carbon emission reduction. So, well, transition finance is defined in many ways, but in my definition, transition finance is focused on reducing emissions, and in financing, really focused on the assessment of transition and the trajectory of the emissions. So in that sense, the advent of the climate-related financial disclosure is critical, and certainly TCFD laid a foundation for that, and the ISSB may be replacing TCFD, but certainly further farm that foundation so that emission-focused transition finance can flourish. As Alex-san mentioned, that the G-Fund's transition finance strategies covers climate solution financing to the aligned and financing to the aligning and the managed phase out of stranded assets. And the covering all those things, the kind of universal feature among them is the focus on emission, how emissions can be reduced in the way that is consistent with the trajectory with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target and Paris climate goal. So the climate-related financial disclosure helps the provide information on emissions, but in the way that how those emissions are related with the business activities, with the risks of that particular company or the opportunities for that particular company and so on and so forth. So climate financial disclosure facilitated by TCFD and ISSB provides a foundation for that kind of very rich information related with emission. It's not just emission data themselves, but emission related with business strategy, risk management, opportunities, and all those things. So I believe, well, in incorporating the TCFD recommendation into our corporate disclosure framework and the ISSB, incorporating ISS standards into a corporate disclosure system is the very fundamental measure to facilitate transition finance framework in Japan. And in that sense, Japan FSA is very much supportive of incorporating those framework into our regulatory system. In fact, already prime section listed companies are required to disclose in accordance with the TCFD framework and equivalents or equivalent. And equivalent means that ISSB standard actually. So in that sense, prime section listed companies in Japan are already required to disclose according to ISSB standards. But we plan to do more than that. So SSBJ, a Sustainability Standards Board of Japan, is now contemplating the standards based on IFRS S1 and S2, and to publish the exposure draft by the end of next year. And actually, in 1.5 year time, they finalize those standards. So in parallel with that development, we will we will incorporate the ISSB standards into our regulatory system so that the transition finance can further flourish in Japan, not only for Japanese company, but for the ASEAN companies or other companies which are closely related with the supply chains and the value chains of Japanese corporations.
Thank you very much, Ikeda-san, for sharing your insight and your candid views on what is coming up in Japan. Now, let me ask the fourth speaker, Kitagawa-san, who is the only panelist from non-financial sector. My question to you is, how should businesses address the ever-developing discussions on climate-related financial disclosures? Kitagawa-san, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nagamura-san. Yeah, and thank you all members. Today is a very precious opportunity for us. Let me introduce firstly our company. Please show the slide. Yeah, thank you. So JERA was a very young company created 2015. As you know, JERA was created through the consolidation of the fuel thermal power and overseas power generation. Department of the Tokyo Electric Power Company called TEPCO and Chuba Electric Power Company. Energy company capable of competing in global energy market and providing a stable supply of globally competitive energy, all while increasing in corporate value. Gerard's and this slide and below side, our mission and vision is highlighted our commitment to solving the world's energy issues. We announced JERA Zero CO2 emissions 2050 already in October 2020 as a long-term initiative to realize our mission and vision. Okay, next slide is JERA's hold full value chain, and JERA's strengths its value chain, which covers LNG development, transportation, and power generation. Along with gas, JERA handles one of the largest volumes of LNG in the world. And continuously, in order to deepen the understanding of stakeholders, mainly investors, we are working to improve the quality of our security reports. We started IFRS standards in this year and integrated reports, as well as a listed company. As already as the members mentioned, we conduct transition finance to reduce CO2 emissions, but in addition to the two disclosure materials, we place importance on communication with each stakeholders so that financial institutions and investors have a better understanding of our strategy for decarbonization and stable supply. And in addition, with regard to the rule-making on disclosure, we'd like to make sure that we fully understand the rationale behind its and respond and climate disclosure standards in last June. And the timing of application in Japan and the timing of disclosure of the final standards have been clarified. Hopefully, this will help with the preparation. Please see the last slide. Yep. And this is the zero emissions roadmap for 2050. In 2020, we announced this commitment ahead of other companies and demonstrated our commitment to climate change. This clarifies the path to net zero and will take 3 approaches. One is the complementarity between renewable energy and zero CO2 emission thermal power generation. 2, establishment of roadmaps sustainable for each country and region. And finally, 3, adapting smart transition. Additionally, TCFD disclosure began on the best effort basis on 2021, followed by a quantitative assessment of the financial impact using scenario analysis in 2022. And this year, we are also working gradually expand the target businesses of scenario analysis to overseas sectors. And our challenges that we will face in energy transition is into decarbonization, decarbonized power sources. It's called zero emission thermal power and renewable energy. While achieving both a stable supply and electricity and economic efficiency and uncertain business environment, such as future power demand and the restart of nuclear power. We'll work to execute the decarbonization roadmap while assessing these uncertainties. And also, the second point is JERA's contributions to achieving a carbon neutral society. As a global energy company, we must demonstrate our commitment to reduce emissions on a global scale through the entire supply chain from upstream to downstream. Okay. Since around 2020, we often heard the word TCFD became popular among the population. Investors have begun to rush to hear about the decarbonization strategies. So we could like to more effort to ensure about the increase in financed emissions do not lead us to refrain from investing and lending in high emission companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitagawa-san. I could sense the level of intensity of JERA's efforts to communicate its transition strategy to the investor and financial community. Thank you for that. Now that we have heard from all sides of the sphere of transition, let me take another moment to lay the ground for the second round of discussions, where we take a step further to focus on some technical aspects to promote decision-useful disclosures. When you think about achieving net zero by 2050, it is not enough to decarbonize your own operation. In order to bring the whole society down to net zero, it is necessary to encourage your entire value chain to follow suit. Doing so requires companies to engage with their suppliers, which often includes SMEs, to share the goal. This may include implementing emission reduction measures, supporting their planning and action for net zero transition, and gather relevant data and information to evaluate the progress. The intervention may originate from other parties as well. It could be a company's customers, business partners, investors, or financial institutions that request for carbon data of its products and services or that of its production processes. Speaking of investors and financial institutions, they too are subject to disclosing transition plans. And that cannot be done without credible emission data of their investees or clients. I would therefore like to shed light on how investors and financial institutions can support the real economy transition efforts towards carbon neutrality by 2050, which cannot be done without nudging corporates to disclose more about their climate-related data, including emissions. Before I ask the panelists, let me draw from an asset owner's case. Prior to this panel, we heard a keynote speech from Mr. Miyazono, president of the Government Pension Investment Fund of Japan, or GPIF, and learned that his fund contemplates climate change risk as something that affects all asset classes and securities simultaneously, which cannot be eliminated through diversification, and has a very high likelihood of materializing in the long term. Recognizing climate risk as such, the GPIF has kept disclosing its climate-related risk analysis in response to the TCFD recommendations since 2019. The fund released its 2022 ESG report a week ago, which is available both in English and Japanese. The report has kept enriching year over year, and for those who are interested in asset owners' approach to ESG investment, it is worth taking a look at. I think corporate leaders also benefit from reading this material, as it is a good indication of how disclosed climate-related information are used. The report displays multiple analyses whose focus includes the fund's portfolio GHG emissions, sector-by-sector comparison, carbon intensity, the status of emission reduction target setting, implied temperature rise, climate value at risk, and very interestingly, avoided emissions, which has been added from this year and which was the subject of the previous session. So that does it for asset owner perspective. Let us hear from our panelists with a focus on how corporate disclosure can facilitate further transition finance. Ishikawa-san, are you still there? Hopefully. Let us hear from you on what kind of disclosure makes you easier to provide more transition finance. Ishikawa-san?
Sure, thank you very much. Let me, before addressing your question, I'd like to go back to what Ikeda-san just said earlier, and that reminds me of what type of metrics we are developing within Net Zero Banking Alliance. The idea here is, as Ikeda-san said, we want to finance the emission reduction, the delta. And the way we think about it is kind of saying emission reduction return on investment. So this is not in financial return on investment, but return on an investment in a sense that what's the finance emission reduction or emission reduction as a result of dollar amount you provide. And the good news for a bank is that we can finance directly to companies like JERA or others. We're not investor in the secondary market. So we can receive that type of data directly from our clients. And therefore, maybe that we can use those inputs for the purpose of developing KPI. And that's exactly what we are working on to complement the work of GFANS, as Alex explained. Going to Nagamura-san, your question. So let me explain where we are in terms of transition plan of MUFG and how we are trying to achieve our target of 2015 net zero, but also 2030 interim target. And I want to, I know, Nagamura-san, you mentioned about GPIF report, and I don't want to put a lot of documents in front of the audience, but we have this one published. This was, again, 10 days ago or so. We published this transition finance, transition white paper 2.0, about 10 days ago to showcase where we are. And at the end of the day, our transition plan is all about client engagement. And I want to just spend a few minutes on that one. So we said that in the white paper, we said engagement is how we pursue net zero, not divestment. We also stressed that our net zero can only be achieved when the whole of the economy is aligned to net zero, because our balance sheet reflects the underlying economy of Japan, Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, we're not prioritizing greening our balance sheet. Rather, we want to prioritize whole of economy transition. The development of white paper allowed us to have a very good understanding of how the interdependencies operate between the relevant sectors, especially in the context of energy supply. And that's why JR is very important in this discussion. Japan, as well as ASEAN economies, emission profile are very different from Europe or US. For example, more than 50% of CO2 emissions coming from energy, where the same number, for example, in France would be like 13%, I think UK 20+%, US 30% or so. So for Japan, for Asia, energy transition is critical. Without that, we don't see a scenario where other sectors, for example, steel, cement, glass, et cetera, can achieve their net zero. This is why even when we engage with our high-emitting sectors, such as steel, glass, et cetera, as I said, we need to take account the progress of energy transition. Japan, as METI folks know much more than I do, but Japan has no electricity grid nor the pipeline connected with the rest of the world. So energy transition strategy is not just about the fuel to generate electricity, but also delivery of such fuels. The good news here is that this is not a new challenge for Japan. Energy supply has always been the possible weakness, and this is exactly why Japan developed LNG global supply chain since early 70s. We will have to do the same this time, but no CO2 emission fuel and no CO2 delivery until the fuel comes to Japan. Needless to say, affordability is also critical, and stable supply given the geopolitical tension around the world. So we need to take care of all those factors. Energy transition can only be successful if the private sector and the public sector work with the same vision and same timeline. In this sense, I think the technology roadmap that METI published is an excellent initiative to align the vision and the timeline so that we can work with our clients with the same timeline. As a financial institution, we're not just waiting for corporates to develop transition plan. Rather, we're proactively engaging with those companies to identify opportunities, but respectfully challenge their transition plan so that we are fully comfortable with their plan and the viability of those plans so that we can finance their transition strategies. Disclosure, as we've been discussing, will be definitely helpful in identifying these opportunities, but all of us need to be proactive in understanding the opportunities, either by engaging with the whole of supply chain ecosystem or by convening different sector representatives. The white paper we produced was the result of interactive engagement with our clients. Actually, we spent hours and hours, sometimes more than 20, 30 hours with our clients. And that's why we ended up developing this. And we think it's a global common good that we publish this. And that's why we prepared this in English and it's in the website. The key here is to contextualize. We're not just saying, here's what we're going to do. But the key here is why we're doing this. What's the challenge of Japanese corporates, or what are the challenges ASEAN countries are facing? So all of that will contextualize and allow the audience, whether in Europe or US, Asia, to understand what we're doing, but also why we're doing. One last thing, it's 185 pages of documents. So this is going to be part of our transition plan. But of course, not everything will be included in the transition plan. But if you, I'm sure all of you are busy, but if you could spare maybe 10 minutes to read chapter 1 and 7. Why chapter 1 and 7? Because I wrote them. But chapter 2 and chapter 6 are very important because that's where the substance are. So chapter 1 and 7 talking about our transition strategy and philosophy and all the key technologies required for Japan to become net zero aligned. It's in chapter 4 through 7. So if you could have a look at it and let us know your reaction, that would be very much appreciated. Let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ishikawa-san, for sharing what the MUFG's findings through its white paper, which I think is indeed a massive undertaking. I hope the output will capture the attention of many policymakers across the board. Now, let me turn to Ikeda-san. Let us hear from you on the FSA's expectation on enhanced disclosures in the context of promoting transition. Since we're running out of time, if you can limit your comments within, say, 3 minutes, if possible, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. Well, for financial institutions, particularly banks, we've been continuing saying that, well, although we certainly require them to disclose certain climate financial related information, and under the ISSB standards, the certainly financed emission disclosures are a requirement, but the most important thing that a financial institution should do in relation to the transitioning to net zero is that they really work with the portfolio companies to make them able to transition to net zero rather than just divesting from them. And so our approach and the eventual kind of regulatory framework or supervisory framework will be consistent with that overall idea of making sure that the proper whole of the economy transition will be secured by the intervention by the financial sector, so that that the financial sector would not have a kind of dream that they alone can be insulated from the climate related financial risks. Because if the whole of the economy transition to net zero, physical risk remain, and that will eventually influence the financial viability of the financial sector in the end. So that's the overall idea that JFA is thinking in terms of addressing this issue. Having said that, there are some, kind of regulatory holes where, such kind of perverse incentive for financial institutions to be encouraged to divest from high emitting companies. So that is where we need to work on. I'm not saying that the JFSA has that kind of regulatory system, but if you look around the globe, there is a risk that such perverse incentive could be found in certain regulatory systems. So I really hope that JFSA is kind of the good advocates for working on that kind of potential hole and to establish a proper ecosystem for climate-related financial disclosure of financial institutions and the transition finance framework. So I suppose.
Thank you, Ikeda-san, for sharing your perspectives from the regulatory office. Turning to Miki-san, could you elaborate on the question on effective disclosure? And if you can also touch briefly on the transition plan task force, it would be great.
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned earlier, that we see the GFAN's Net Zero Transition Plan framework as a strategic tool. But disclosure is really important because that's the whole purpose of TCFD, is to provide decision useful information for investors and for broader stakeholders as well. So the disclosure of the transition plan is important. And that's why the UK, when we were COP26 president, we launched a transition plan task force, which is co-chaired between the government, so the Minister of the Treasury, and GFANS, essentially Amanda Blanc, who led our Net Zero Transition Plan framework. So this is a practitioner-led group, but it's connected to the government, the FCA, your colleagues in London, and the Bank of England are part of the working group as well. So it's led by the Treasury. So it's a private working group, similar to the one that Tomo-san mentioned here in Japan. And they've taken the GFANS framework and they've put it into pre-regulatory standards. So in October, or is it October now? This month, they're going to come up with their final standards. And then the FCA and other parts of the regulatory system will make a transition plan disclosure requirement, which is brilliant because a lot of the people involved in GFANS were involved in TCFD, right? Mike Bloomberg was a TCFD chair, Mark Carney was the FSB chair, and now they're the co-chairs. My boss, Mary Shapiro, was the head of the Secretariat. And what we're seeing is the same theory of change where practitioners identify what works and what's needed and what's best practice is, and then that gets put into standards. In this case, the ISSB and the domestic implementation of that we were hearing about. But that process from the launch of the TCFD to the ISSB to domestic implementation has taken about 10 or 11 years, but we don't have 10 or 11 years. We need to see that process speeded up significantly. And that's why it's good that the FSB, also the G20 Financial Stability Board, is going to start looking at transition plans. And it's good that they've got a starting block, which is the GFANS transition plan framework, so that when people go to implement transition plan disclosure requirements domestically, there's not too much fragmentation. They're starting from a common starting point.
Great, thank you. So we look forward to the output from TPT later this month. Thank you. Now, let me turn to Kitagawa-san. From an industry perspective, and especially as a power producer, I imagine that you're facing considerable challenges in securing finance and investment for transition. Would you be able to share your story with us to the extent possible in 3 minutes?
Okay. Thank you. We faced often the difficulties from the investors' question. Especially in Europe, seems to regard blended combustion of coal and ammonia as extending life of coal-fired power plants. Our understanding that substitution is a process for the development and early introduction of ammonia power generation technology. And the ultimate goal is to achieve zero CO2 emissions, single fuel firing. We have also committed to shutting down inefficient coal plants. We want to make sure our message is clear. And so difficulties and ideas to communicate the situation of the countries and industries where JERA operates such kinds of zero emission strategy for thermal power generation and building the necessary supply chain. So successful experience, for example, just transition plan ratings and feedback received from stakeholders, including shareholders. Yeah. And finally, I'd like to mention just 2 points. The first is a decarbonization strategy. It comes from the geopolitical situation of Japan itself as an island nation, but by using existing power plant equipment and burning fuel that does not emit CO2, emission is reduced. And at the same time, we'll increase renewable assets by participating in development projects. will make efforts to support Japan's stable supply through a combination of these. Whenever I talk about this, we receive many questions and concerns from investors and others. So even with the introduction of renewable energy in the case of Japan, there are not many large land in the country for wind farm. So although such things are obvious, I feel that it is necessary to explain them carefully, more and more. And the last, another point is that our company is not only focused on providing our solutions for the Japanese market, but rather to do so globally. So we'd like to, our vision envisions a future in which we contribute to the healthy growth and development of Asia and the world by providing a clean energy supply infrastructure that combines renewable energy. So, and finally, low carbon thermal power. Our vision, our future in which contribute to healthy growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitagawa-san. It was so encouraging to learn that JERA is really thinking about the global perspective, not just confined to this country. Thank you very much. Now we're running out of time, but organizers, do I have the luxury of taking another minute or two to wrap up? See no objections, so let me do a quick wrap-up of the discussion. We recognize the growing expectation towards enhanced climate-related corporate disclosures, which is driven by the publication of the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. Climate-related corporate disclosures are an essential element in advancing efforts towards net zero transition in the real economy. As financial institutions intensify their support to net zero transition, the demand for standardized disclosure information will only increase. Financial institutions recognize the importance of evaluating and disclosing their financed emissions properly, which is hopeful to substantially support the decarbonization of the real economy. Speaking of which, we welcome the paper on addressing the challenges of financed emissions, which was developed by Japan Public and Private Working Group on Financed Emissions to promote a transition finance, and was released earlier today, as Ishikawa-san mentioned. At the same time, companies are expected to develop and communicate their own transition strategies so to convince stakeholders their business growth potential and sustainability. Transition plans need to be consistent with the Paris Agreement and supported by climate-related information that aligns with internationally recognized methodologies. Let me add that within the TCFD consortium, numerous discussions are being held, including the disclosure of transition plans. Please stay tuned for the next keynote speech and panel discussions, which will cover the topic. With that, I would like to close the session. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their valuable contribution. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nagamura and the panelists for insightful discussion.